Hello. The topic of this lecture is determinism and related concepts. There are four major concepts to keep track of: determinism, indeterminism, compatibilism, and incompatibilism in Unit 2. And it's very important to keep those four things straight and distinct and keep track of what's actually what. And so to that end, I'd like in this lecture to cover some of the things that people tend to mix up most often. And some of the sorts of very poor arguments that sometimes get made in this particular topic, and try and caution you to avoid some of those. Of course, this lecture is not intended to replace the text. It's intended to go right along with the text and try and highlight some things that sometimes people miss about the text, as well as correct some things that people tend to misunderstand, and try and clarify some of the things that I don't think the text does particularly well. So the first of those is what we'll call this confusion number one to avoid, is that compatibilism is a third view and it's an alternative to determinism and indeterminism. Okay, that's a confusion to avoid. Compatibilism, there's this view that where people sometimes think that compatibilism is somehow in between determinism and indeterminism, and it is not. Okay. Now, to explain why it is not, I'd like to bring in some other considerations here. Okay? There are two fundamental laws of logic, right? The logic is what we talk about when we talk about the science of reasoning and reasoning well. So concepts like validity, which we've already had some brush with, is a central concept in logic. But essentially, there are two fundamental laws of logic. The first is the law of non-contradiction. That is, nothing is both true and false at the same time. Okay, that's a basic, right? It's soon as something is like literally contradictory. So, for example, a vase cannot be blue and colorless at the same time, right? That because it would be true that it was blue, and then it would also be false that it was blue because it was colorless. That things are not true and false at the same time. If you say a sentence, it's either true or it's false. It's not both. Okay? So that's the law of non-contradiction. Sounds pretty basic, and it is. The law of excluded middle is another of the basic ones, and it's the one that we're going to pay a little more attention to here. Everything is either true or false. It's never neither. Okay, if you say something about the way the world is, well, either the world is that way or it isn't that way. And so every sentence, everything that says something about something is either true or it's false, right? It's never neither, according to the law of excluded middle, and it's never both, according to the law of non-contradiction. All claims are either true or false, never neither or both. Those are the two fundamental laws of logic, and again, they make perfect sense and they seem pretty basic, and they are. Okay, so what that means is that literally everything in the universe is either a potato or not a potato. Once you've gone through the entire universe and sorted things into two piles, right? You will only have two piles. You will have the pile of things that are potatoes and a pile of things that are not potatoes. Now, of course, there are controversial cases. You might say French fries. Well, I mean, you might say they're made out of potatoes, so are they potatoes or are they something distinct, French fry? Well, you can argue about this all you like, but in the end, you're going to have to say they either are potatoes or are not potatoes, and they go in one pile or the other. Okay? So saying that the law of excluded middle means that things are either true or false doesn't mean that we don't disagree about what's true or false, but it does mean that when we have a disagreement, somebody's wrong, even if it's not clear or will never be clear who. Okay? And so the law of excluded middle is going to apply here. You might think, what do potatoes have to do with determinism or indeterminism? Well, here we go. Let's take a look at the definition of determinism and indeterminism. Okay? Determinism is the view that every event is caused. Right? Indeterminism is the view that at least one event is uncaused, or another way to put that is some events are uncaused. Okay? That's it. Okay? So if you look at these definitions, it becomes pretty clear that there is no middle ground here, right? It's not logically possible. If every event is caused, then determinism is true. If not every event is caused, then indeterminism is true. Those are your options. Okay, that's it. If no events are caused, well, indeterminism is still true because at least one isn't caused in that case. So if they're all caused, it's determinism. If they're not all caused, it's indeterminism. Okay, those are the relevant facts of the matter. Okay, so there is no intermediate position, and there cannot be, right? One of those two things has to be true. We don't know which, but one of them has to be true. And so here's the thing, I'm a little disappointed in the text. It sort of implies that compatibilism is a third position between determinism and indeterminism. Thanks to the long excluded middle, we know now that there cannot be any such thing. One of the ways that the things that makes this more confusing is that sometimes people call compatibilism soft determinism, right, to make it as if there are two different kinds, right? And again, that's not exactly accurate. People do, in fact, sometimes call compatibilism soft determinism, and we'll examine why here in just a second. Instead, what we want to be clear about compatibilism is that it's a whole different issue than determinism or indeterminism, right? One of those two things has to be true. And then there's a whole separate argument that is compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And that's a separate thing to keep track of, right? And compatibilism refers to a number of views about the relationship between determinism or indeterminism and other things, right? There are lots of different kinds of compatibilism. And the text tends to sort of lump together those other things, right? The biggest couple that people talk about are free will and responsibility, whether it be legal responsibility, moral responsibility, or whatever kind. People tend to say that, people say, compatibilists say that free will is compatible with determinism, right? That's a common thing for compatibilists to believe. But there, like I said, there are lots of different kinds of compatibilists, and we shouldn't really lump together all of the compatibilisms into one bunch because they're not. All right, so some kinds of determinists, or some kinds of compatibilists, sorry, say that determinism is compatible with free will. Okay, free will is more or less the idea that people make decisions. This is going to be one of those things where people are going to argue about a lot. The definition of free will, what does that actually mean to have free will? Okay, this is going to be the main disagreement that compatibilists will have with people who are incompatibilists. Okay, and so we get lots of different perspectives on this. If you look at D'Holbach's argument, D'Holbach says no. Okay, determinism is not compatible with free will, and he thinks that that's the case because he thinks that because determinism is true, it cannot be true that we make decisions. Okay. He thinks that free will is defined properly in such a way that if determinism were true, you wouldn't have that thing. Okay. D'Holbach defines free will much the way many people do. The idea is the ability to do otherwise than you in fact did. Okay, something like that. And that's something like what D'Holbach has in mind. And because he doesn't think people can do otherwise, he thinks that there is no such thing as free will. Okay. And so that's what makes him an incompatibilist. Okay, he answers no to the question of, is determinism compatible with free will? Right? So D'Holbach is an incompatibilist. But D'Holbach is also a determinist. James is also an incompatibilist. He thinks that free will is not compatible with determinism. He thinks of free will actually very similarly to the way that D'Holbach does. I think their definitions probably more or less agree with each other of what free will is, and they both agree that if determinism is true, then free will can't exist alongside of it. Right? They're incompatibilists. James thinks that because people make decisions, determinism cannot be true. Right? He sort of gets goes in that direction with things. And we'll talk about going in that direction with things again later in this lecture. Other sorts of compatibilists that the text mentions are Stace and Hobart. These are sort of the first compatibilists that get mentioned. And they believe that free will is compatible with determinism. Right? Now, in order to say that, they offer a definition of free will that is different than James's or D'Holbach's. Okay? They say that free will means nothing more than decisions that are not externally constrained. Okay, so I want to pause here for a second and note, for the purposes of one of our discussion board assignments, that constraint and influence are not at all the same thing. Okay, somebody might suggest something to me, like say, hey, you should really go see a particular movie, right? That will influence my decision to see the movie, and that would be an external influence because it's outside of me. It comes from somebody else. That's not a constraint, okay? Now, say that somebody tied me up, threw me in a van, and took me to see a particular movie, right? That would be an external constraint. I would not be free to decide not to see the movie, or at least not to be there. I could close my eyes, I suppose, or like, assume they pinned them open or something like that. That's sort of gruesome, but again, this is the sort of thing we mean by an external constraint, right? Something that you do not have any say in. Okay, and for Stace and Hobart, any decision that doesn't involve that kind of external constraint is a free one. And they mean that as long, and so what they mean is that they think that's perfectly compatible with determinism, because what goes on is that say somebody recommends that I go see a movie, right? Well, look, I mean, I can take their recommendation or I cannot take their recommendation, but whether I do or not, I will have some reasons for taking it or not taking it, right? I will have grown up a certain way. I will have had certain prior experiences with this person. Say, for example, that every movie that this person or most of the movies that this person recommends are really good movies, or that I'm probably likely to those are past events that are likely to influence my decision, right, to go ahead and go see it. Or if this person recommends terrible movies, that would be a factor in my not going to see it, right? And there are lots and lots and lots of factors. So many that it's probably impossible to keep track of them all. But you can still say that all of those factors, when you add them all up, they end up causing me to do one thing or to do the other. But as long as nobody actually made me do it, then it still counts as freedom, because all of those causes were my causes. They operated within me, and they were the kind of thing that, again, nobody took the decision out of my hands. Everybody let the causes that are my causes run as they will. And so that's a compatibilist idea of free will. At least it's one compatibilist idea of free will. Schlick is another thinker described in the book. A lot of some of his writings are in the text as well. Thinks of things similarly to Stace and Hobart, but he says that free will should also mean nothing more than decisions that are not internally or externally constrained. That is, Schlick introduces the concept of an internal constraint. Now, again, keep a distinction between something that is an influence and a constraint. Okay, so again, say somebody offers you a chocolate sundae, but you're on a diet. Now, the fact that you really, really, really like chocolate will be an influence on your decision, an internal influence. And if you decide, you know what, I like the chocolate, I can, resume my diet tomorrow. Okay, well, that's perfectly your decision. You aren't constrained by any external or internal force. And that's what Schlick thinks that's really all we mean by freedom, right? Is that we're not constrained in some way. Now, an internal constraint is something like a kind of compulsion or what we might call a mental illness of some kind, something that is completely not resistible no matter what happens, or something like that, something that operates outside the normal bounds of human decision making. Right? Something might be very, very tempting without being an internal constraint. Okay. If you think of an internal constraint as something that would probably that might get you found innocent in a court, something like that, or something that might get you declared incompetent to stand trial, or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that Schlick means by internal constraint. Now, of course, there are controversial cases, and that's what's really interesting about this, to try to describe really what we mean and which of these definitions is ultimately most reasonable. But notice, Schlick and Stace and Hobart are all determinists, right? They all believe that determinism is true, or at least they operate under that assumption, and they think that there's just no reason to say that believing that determinism is true means believing that there's no such thing as free will. He thinks they define free will in such a way that it's compatible with determinism. That's what makes them one kind of compatibilist. again, I mentioned before that I was a little disappointed that the text kind of lumps together free will and responsibility. And lots of people do end up lumping those things together. They think they sort of, for many folks, free will and responsibility stand or fall together. The idea is that if you don't have free will, well, you're not responsible. And if you are responsible, well, then you have free will, right? They think that those two things do stand or fall together. I don't think that's necessarily true. And certainly there are folks that we have in our text who do not think that this is true. Okay. And so responsibility is something like the idea that people are responsible in some meaningful way for what they do. Right, whether it be legally responsible, that is such that they could be punished for a crime, or morally responsible, etc. Okay, something like that. Now again, Dahlbach is a determinist, and he is an incompatibilist. Okay, he thinks that our many social institutions that are founded on the idea of responsibility are simply mistaken. Right? He thinks that no such thing really applies. Okay, he is an incompatibilist, and he is a determinist. James and Sartre think that if, that they're also incompatibilists, but they are incompatibilist indeterminists, right? They think that that free will, or responsibility in this case, responsibility is not compatible with determinism, and they use that as a reason for saying that that indeterminism must be the case, because they think we clearly are responsible for this. Okay. Again, there are a number of other views here, but of course, Dennett is one of those views that the text doesn't really say very much about his views. He's very, very briefly mentioned in passing, and it doesn't really describe his view particularly well. But his view, described in two different books, one of them called Elbow Room and another called Freedom Evolves, both really excellent books, is something like this, right? That responsibility is compatible with determinism. Right, and in fact, he sort of puts it further. He says that that responsibility is compatible with determinism, but incompatible with indeterminism. That is, only when every action is reliably caused can we make sense of what it means to hold somebody responsible for something. Right? Imagine you did, for example. So here's how it might go. Imagine you say you killed somebody because you were really mad at them. Okay, it seems like you're responsible for that, right? You're responsible for being the kind of person that either can't or didn't control your anger in that particular way, right? And so it makes sense to say, well, look, if you're the kind of person that can't control your anger and you would kill somebody, and you deserve the punishment for it. Okay. Notice we're not saying that that indeterminism has to be the case, right? We're just saying, yeah, look, causes are relevant to punishments. But now imagine you killed somebody for no reason at all. Like just none. I mean, just like literally no reason. Okay, it was an uncaused action. You just sort of, you were walking down the street one minute, and the next minute you've killed somebody, right? That it's just that random. Okay, well, it stands to reason that if indeterminism is true, then at least some of those kinds of things must happen. Because again, remember, indeterminism is the view that not all things are caused, and so some things happen for no reason at all. Well, are the things that happen for no reason at all the kinds of things you want to punish people for, the kinds of things that you hold people responsible for? Dennett thinks that's absurd. Okay? He thinks that it's absurd to think that responsibility is compatible with indeterminism. He thinks it's quite obvious to say it's compatible with determinism. And that's, but of course, Dennett is an incompatibilist with respect to free will and determinism. He defines free will much the way that Sartre and James and Dahlbach do, and thinks that it's not compatible with free will. But he thinks responsibility is. Okay? And like I said, there are many, many, many more different sort of nuanced views that are possible here, some of which are covered by the text, some of which are not. And so anytime the word compatibilism or incompatibilism is used, it's really, really important to be clear what is compatible or incompatible with what. Okay, so I very much encourage you, when you say compatibilism, you should say compatibilism of determinism and free will, right? Or incompatibilism of free will and indeterminism, or something like that, right? I mean, the idea is you want to keep track of who's saying what is or isn't compatible with what. That will make things clearer in your own head, and it will make things clearer when you write about these things and think about these things. And so to resume Dennett's argument that we were talking about is that responsibility is compatible with indeterminism, but compatible with determinism. And that makes Dennett a compatibilist of one kind, but he's an incompatibilist of another kind because he doesn't think that free will is compatible with determinism. Right. So we can put these folks here just on a bit of a table to summarize what we've just said about them. Okay. So d'Holbach is a determinist, and he's an incompatibilist with respect to free will and an incompatibilist with respect to responsibility. That is, he thinks free will is incompatible with determinism, and he thinks responsibility is incompatible with determinism as well. Stace and Hobart and Schlick are all determinists. They all think determinism is true, or all operate under the assumption that it's true. They all believe that determinism is compatible with free will because of the definition of free will that they have in mind. And they also believe that responsibility is compatible with determinism. Okay, so they're all compatibilists of a particular kind. James and Sartre are not determinists, or at least they operate under the assumption that determinism is not true. They also don't think that determinism is compatible with free will, and they do not think that determinism is compatible with responsibility. David Hume, was also mentioned in the text, is not a determinist, right? But he does think that determinism is compatible with free will, and he does think that determinism is compatible with responsibility. And so he's a compatibilist, okay, but he's not a determinist, right? While Stace, Hobart, and Schlick are determinists and compatibilists. Dennett is a determinist, that is, he operates under the assumption that determinism is true. He does not think it's compatible with free will, but he does think it's compatible with responsibility. You'll notice that not every possible position's been covered here. Not every possible combination is there. Somebody somewhere has explored that combination somewhere in philosophy, but again, we're mentioning only the ones that are here in our text. All right, so to add a few more views, some more confusion to this, the word libertarianism is often used in the text. Okay? And this is the name given to a family of views that are indeterminist and incompatibilist, right? Who tend to think that that determinism is incompatible with both free will and responsibility, right? That often gets the name libertarianism. So we sort of group those views together. Notice it has nothing at all to do with political libertarianism or like the Libertarian Party. It's a completely different usage of the word altogether. So no relationship whatsoever, at all, in any way. It comes from different places. All right, so that's the first confusion to avoid. It's a big one. Okay, so to put things in a nutshell before moving on to confusion number two, confusion number one is don't think of compatibilism as some extra view, right? That's some view that's in between determinism and indeterminism. It's an extra view. Okay, there's determinism and indeterminism. That's one debate, and then there's compatibilism versus incompatibilism is an entirely separate debate, and they sort of they cross paths in a lot of different ways. Okay, all right, so a second confusion to avoid, this is when we're thinking about determinism here, is that determined and predetermined mean the same thing. You don't want to think that because they don't mean the same thing. Okay, determined and predetermined are not the same thing. Don't be confused and think that they are. Okay, the view that things are predetermined is a view called fatalism. Okay, determinism is simply the view that all events are caused. That's all. Okay, that's it. That's it. Things are determined. That's all. Okay. Fatalism is a view that all causes have been laid out from the beginning, right? Usually intentionally, right? If you've heard of something like predestination, a sort of Christian doctrine held by Calvinists and some of their intellectual descendants, they're fatalists, right? They believe that all causes have been laid out from the very beginning. In this case, intentionally by the Creator, right? But there are other kinds of fatalism, right? But fatalism and determinism are not at all the same thing, and so don't assume that they must be. Right? One just says that everything has a cause, and the other one says that everything has a cause, and those causes were laid out all from the beginning or something like that. Those are just not the same thing. So don't get them confused. Okay? So think of it this way, as for example, before you roll dice, there are not causes determining the outcome. After you let them go, physics determines the eventual outcome. Okay. Whereas, again, Calvinist predestination is a good example of the view of fatalism. All right, a third confusion to avoid, okay, is about prediction. Okay, so you want to say, well, look, if determinism was true, we could predict everything. Well, yes, right? But just consider how many causes there are in even very routine things. Okay, the ability to actually predict something doesn't really have anything to do with whether it is determined or undetermined. Okay, so predictability and determinism or indeterminism, there's only a very, very loose fit here. So, for example, many quantum physicists believe that quantum phenomena are indeterministic. Okay? Now, this is disputable. That depends on which interpretation of quantum mechanics you go in for. Some of them have the consequence that quantum phenomena are indeterministic, and some models do not have that result. But in any case, we'll go with it for now. Quantum theory itself is still around because it's actually very effective at predicting quantum events. Okay, so despite the fact that there's some indeterminism involved in the model itself is actually quite effective as a predictive model. And so we can say that at least some indeterministic systems are amenable to prediction, right? Even though some, of course, are not. Many deterministic systems are effectively unpredictable due to their complexity. So consider the game Plinko. If you don't know this, or if you don't watch The Price is Right like ever, then just look it up on YouTube. You can see it. Nobody would really argue that Plinko is not deterministic, right? It's entirely deterministic. Things are just bouncing around and following the laws of gravity and physics and all that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, it's impossible to accurately forecast. As much as people might try to make their little peg go exactly in the same path twice in a row, it just never happens. Okay, because you've got round things bouncing off of other round things with all sorts of different frictional coefficients involved. There are just too many causes to ever possibly render it a completely predictable system. So we can say that some deterministic systems are not amenable to prediction, even though some are. All right, the fourth confusion to avoid is this idea that this is a way that a lot of people tend to argue. They say, well, look, if determinism or indeterminism were true, then life would become some particular way. So, for example, say if determinism is true, then everybody would have to walk around like zombies, just following all their causes. Well, that's ridiculous. Or if indeterminism were true, then everybody would just sort of randomly do things for no reason at all, right? Which is, again, a little bit ridiculous. Here's the problem with this, okay? Number one, this is a version of if X were true, we wouldn't like it, so X is not true. Okay, this is obviously a bad argument or a bad inference. Okay, whether we like something or not, or has no bearing on its actual truth or falsehood. And so let's put that right out. Here's the second thing. If determinism is true, then it always has been. If indeterminism is true, then it always has been. Okay, and so what would life be like if determinism were true? Okay, close your eyes. Now open them. That's what life would be like if determinism were true. Okay? Now you say, okay, well, what would life be like if indeterminism were true? All right, now close your eyes. Now open them again. Hey, that's what life would be like if indeterminism were true. If it's true now, it's always been true, and so life would be just like it is. Okay? So this line of thought just doesn't go anywhere. So for goodness sakes, don't be confused. All right, so now let's take a look at some arguments that people often make that surround the issue of determinism, indeterminism, compatibilism, and incompatibilism. And I want to point out some of the ones that really just sort of they're just the real bad ones. And so hopefully we can avoid those and then push into some better ones. All right, so let's take a look at this first one. Bad argument number one is this. Okay, somebody say, well, look, the future is not set in stone, so determinism must be false. Well, people say that a lot, right? But think about it for a second. Here's why this argument is bad. If by not set in stone you mean hasn't happened yet, well, then there's no real disagreement. Everybody agrees that the future hasn't happened yet. Okay? Determinists agree that the future hasn't happened yet. Indeterminists agree the future hasn't happened yet. So you're not saying anything important there if you're saying if that's what you mean by not set in stone. If by not set in stone you mean will not be caused by factors that are now present, then you aren't arguing for indeterminism. You just are starting out assuming it. Okay? That's what makes the argument bad, is that you just start out assuming the thing that you think is an argument. Okay? And so that's, we don't really go there. So bad argument number two is this, and this is, I would say, very, very common. Right? It's something like this. It says, hey, look, I made a choice. Therefore, determinism is false. Right? So this is the hand waving argument. Like literally, if you just wave your arm and say, hey, look, I'm waving my arm because I have free will, and therefore indeterminism is true.
Okay, so yeah, it wasn't determined. And in fact, Dolbach directly refutes this one because it's a very, very silly argument. Okay, and so here's why the argument is bad. It skips too many assumptions. It builds in too much stuff. First off, it assumes that choices require indeterminism. That is, it just assumes incompatibilism of free will and determinism. Doesn't argue for it, just assumes it. And then it assumes the reality rather than the illusion of free will. Okay, so remember Dolbach in his argument says, like, look, if you're going to wave your hand and tell me you're free, then what you're doing is you're waving your hand because you want to prove me wrong and believe that waving your hand will prove me wrong. Okay, notice what you're doing is you're following causes. You're doing things for reasons, right? And just not recognizing that that's what's going on here. Right, and so this is really the dispute: is whether whether free will is a reality or it's an illusion. That's what you need to argue about. You can't just say, "Oh, look, every choice I make is a real choice." That's assuming that's just that's not questioning your assumption in any way. Okay, so once these assumptions are spelled out, the argument is just clearly circular. Right, so I made a choice, therefore I have free will. Well, look, you have to have free will in order to make a choice of that kind. Okay, and so again, it's just sort of assuming what you mean to be proving. Okay, so it's just like that first bad argument. So here's bad argument number 3. This is one of James's. I think that James is guilty of giving a couple of quite bad arguments on the course of free will, but we want to try and interpret some of these as charitably as possible. This one I think is just plain bad though. This idea that regret proves that determinism must be false. And so I'd like to give you a bit of an example to try and demonstrate the trouble with this viewpoint. And in order to do that, I'd like to use as an example a piece of classic American cinema, the movie High Noon, starring Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. Right? It's a classic of American cinema. So here's how this goes. It's a Western, as you might be able to tell from both the name and the poster. And it involves, here's Grace Kelly's character here. Her name is Amy, and this is Gary Cooper's character. His name is Will. Now, Will has been for the long time a sheriff of this particular town. I think the town is called Hadleyville, but I'm not quite certain of that. And so, in any case, he's been the sheriff for a long time, and he's really very sweet on Amy. But Amy is a Quaker. This is a religious sect. If you don't really know about the Quakers, go ahead and look them up. But she's a pacifist. Okay, she believes that violence under any and all circumstances is morally wrong, and she also has religious objections to it as well as moral objections. Right, so she's very much a pacifist. And so, as a condition to marry Will, she sort of demands that he stop being the sheriff, because of course the sheriff is occasionally required to do violence, or has to be prepared to do violence in order to protect people, etc., like that. And so again, this is a very strict version of pacifism that says that even that is not morally or spiritually justified. So he thinks, on balance, right, that it's more important to him that he spend his life with her than that he continue to do the job of a sheriff. And so they get married. He resigns as sheriff and becomes a farmer, right, something like that, right? Well, of course, here's trouble in paradise. This here is one of the villains, right, that shows up. The idea is this. I'm going to try and keep the plot synopsis short and sweet, even though there's actually kind of a lot going on in this film. So the story is that somebody that Kane put into prison has gotten out of prison and is bent on revenge, and so has a gang that he gets together. Actually, one of the members of which is played by Lee Van Cleef, who becomes one of the most iconic Western sort of bad guy actors ever. But he's plays a fairly small role in this film. And so anyway, the idea is that they're coming in on the noon train, and they make it known that they're gonna shoot up the town, and they want to get revenge on Will. And so the idea is that Will decides, well, gosh, it's time to, I've got to stand my ground here. I'm not going to run away from them. They'll just keep coming after me. Amy says, no, we got to go. We got to flee town. And so he decides that it's best to stand and fight. Tries to convince lots of the town people to stand and fight with him. Basically, nobody does, but he decides to stand up for the town anyway. And Amy gives him a kind of ultimatum. She says, "Look, I'm leaving on the noon train. There's, buying her ticket, whether you're coming with me or not, And she's just sort of getting out of town, and runs into somebody who sort of ends up kind of changing her mind, and then she ends up going back, and just when the villains have Will sort of cornered, she ends up shooting one of them and killing him. And basically saving Will, but then committing herself an act of violence. And there's of course Grace Kelly does a really excellent job of portraying this sort of moral anguish that the character undergoes at this time, right? Having done in some ways the right thing, but in some ways a very wrong thing. So so there's this sense. This is the piece I really want to focus on, is this profound sense of moral regret that Amy feels in killing a man, right? Of course, the whole time you can say that she did what she did for reasons, right? You can point to those reasons very clearly. She wanted to leave town. She had her reasons for doing that. She had sort of changed her mind based on different kinds of reasons that came to assume more importance as the show goes on. And of course, she has reasons to wish she hadn't had to kill a man. And so this is a case of very profound moral regret. There's a really excellent article by a philosopher named Michael Gill called "Agonizing Decisions and Moral Pluralism," and it very much concerns just this exact case. And so really what I wanted to say here is that Amy here regrets killing, but is her action or her regret unexplainable in a determinist framework? I mean, again, we can say that she had all kinds of reasons the whole time, things that were plausibly causing her to do the things she did, including killing a man. We could understand why she did all those things. We could understand the kinds of causes that are involved, various kinds of emotional and rational and all the sorts of things that work together, and that would lead to her killing a man, despite the fact that she otherwise had commitments against doing so. And so again, if she thought that it was best to leave her husband, okay, and then those thoughts caused her to board a train. And then once she heard the gunfire, she thought there were better reasons to help her husband than there were to leave, and those thoughts caused her to return, and she killed a man. Her regret at killing was caused by the kind of thing that causes regret. That is, regret is the result of a decision that involves a really serious downside. And so again, there doesn't have to be sort of indeterminism involved here to explain regret. That's, I think, James, for whatever reason, very blithely assumes that is the case, and I think that this is, this case and any other can be constructed as one that says you don't need indeterminism for regret. So let's move on to bad argument number 4. Okay, bad argument number 4. It says that science just proves that determinism is true, right? Alternatively, if science is true, then the world is deterministic. Well, that's a bad argument also. Okay. Because here are the facts about this. The world is unable to show us whether all events are caused or not, right? Because what we can't do is we cannot, number one, we can't observe all events, okay? And so remember, determinism is true if everything is caused, okay? Now, in order to know whether everything is caused, we would, in principle, have to observe all events. We can't. A lot of them already happened, right? I mean, like the boat's already sailed on that, okay? Second, we cannot rewind the universe and play it again to see if it would have been any different. And there's actually some question of whether that even matters, but we'll get to that later. But we can't do that, okay? If we invented some machine, okay, that could rewind the universe and play it again, we would always have to wonder, does the machine actually work, right? Is it really doing what we think it's doing? Or is the machine itself sort of deterministic, right? So, it's not an answerable question. Okay? And of course, we do not see, hear, smell, or otherwise detect causes. We don't have causometers. We don't point a little gun at something and say, like pull the little button and scan it and say, oh yeah, that's there's the cause, right? That's just not the way it works. Okay, so the world is unable to tell us whether or not events are caused. The world is unable to tell us whether determinism or indeterminism is ultimately true. Okay, and so when people say that science proves that determinism is true, they're forgetting what depends on what here. There are actually some fundamental assumptions that you have to do in order to do science. Right? So remember, some of these prior bad arguments occurred when people didn't question their assumptions, or sort of didn't even recognize that they were making assumptions. Okay? Well, one of the assumptions that you do when you're doing science is the view of physicalism, otherwise known as materialism. That is, the view that ordinary matter and energy is all that there is. Okay, that everything is physically present, like the whole physical universe. That's everything. Okay, all the things. Once you have all the matter and energy, you have all the things. Okay, that's all there is, nothing more. Okay, that's a view known as physicalism. Okay, and that's a view to which science is committed. Right, they have physical laws. Okay, the laws that govern only matter and energy, and that's ultimately the only thing that applies. They're committed to empiricism. That is the view that our senses reveal information about the external world. Okay, that our senses essentially, right, are telling us something about a world that's outside of ourselves. Okay, that's something you have to assume in order to do science. You can't really prove it, but it's something you assume in order to do science. And the third thing that you assume in order to do science is determinism. You assume that all events are caused. If you're not assuming that all events are caused, what's the whole point of experimental design? What's the point of limiting your variables to try and narrow things down? Science would make no sense if you didn't assume determinism. That doesn't mean determinism is true. That just means that you have to assume determinism in order to make science make sense. Okay, and so the fact that if you like science, great, right? But you're already assuming physicalism, empiricism, and determinism, right? Without being able to prove any of those things, but those are things that you do, and in order to do science. Okay. And so, like the bad arguments that we had that were in favor of indeterminism, this one simply starts by assuming determinism rather than arguing for it. It's more correct to say that if determinism is true, then science is valid, rather than to say because science is valid, determinism must be true. Okay. All right. Here's bad argument number 5. Okay. And this is one about punishment, right? So this is look, if determinism were true, then we wouldn't be able to punish anybody. Okay. Well, this is a combination between confusion number 4 and bad argument number 2. And if you don't remember what those were, you can always go back. Hey, this the video's here. It's here forever. Okay, this idea has 3 problems. Okay, number 1, it makes human life too simple. Okay, so accepting the view that all actions are caused would not automatically make people zombies that were incapable of deliberation. Okay, that's just not how it works. Again, if determinism is true now, it always was, right, and always will be, right. And if determinism isn't true, well, it never was and never will be, right. So that's that. Okay. It also assumes that people are held responsible only for uncaused acts, right? We can go back to something like Dennett's argument here. So imagine if you're doing something, if you're doing it for no reason at all, is that something you're responsible for as opposed to doing something for a reason? It's very strange. And then finally, the fundamental idea of punishment really does assume causation of human actions, right? Why should we have punishments? Right? I mean, what practical purpose do they serve? You say, oh, well, look, if people know that there's a punishment for doing a thing, then they decide to do something else. What, do you mean that the punishment causes them to change their minds about doing something or not doing something? And then, of course, if it doesn't change their minds, well, then you actually carry out the punishment. Otherwise, other people won't respect the system, etc. I mean, the whole story has causes running all up and down it. Okay, so the fundamental idea of punishment assumes causation of human actions. So, for example, if go all the way to if you have a toddler who reaches for a lit candle and you slap their hand, right? To try and communicate the message before they speak really good English or any other language, that, hey, that's bad, don't do it, okay? And so because people don't want to have their hands smacked, they'll start to, they'll learn. And again, that's pure causation, right? And we think that punishment serves that role all the time. All right, so let's take a bit of a retrospective on some of these bad arguments. Here's something they all have in common, right? So all these bad arguments have some sort of circularity in common. So that is assuming something that requires determinism in order to prove that determinism is true, right? Or assuming something that requires indeterminism to prove that indeterminism is true. Okay. Um, Before we move on here for a second, I wanted to say also that something that else is a hallmark of sort of bad argument is to say, well, it's obvious that indeterminism is true, and that must mean that incompatibilism is true, right? Or it's obvious that incompatibilism is true, and that must mean that indeterminism is. And those things just don't stand or fall together, right? There are determinist compatibilists and determinist incompatibilists. There are also indeterminist incompatibilists and indeterminist compatibilists, right? The idea that whether compatibilism or incompatibilism, whether we have free will or don't, whether we are responsible or aren't, doesn't really tell us anything about whether things are or not determined all by itself. What we're trying to do here is not trying to argue whether determinism is true or indeterminism is true. We're trying to argue about if one of them were, right, if the things were one way or the other way, what else would that have to mean for the other kinds of concepts that we have, concepts like free will and concepts like responsibility. And that's where the real meat and potatoes of the discussion is. All right, so I mentioned that James has some arguments that I'm very suspicious about. But I think that there's certainly one of them that gets misinterpreted quite a lot. It gets interpreted as being a very a bad version of itself, really. And so one of the things that I want to point out about James, and this is just a direct quote from James here, he says, I now repeat what I said at the outset, right? That from any strict theoretical point of view, the question is insoluble. Okay? By the question, he means whether determinism or indeterminism is true. He says, to deepen our theoretic sense of the difference between a world with chances in it, that is an undetermined one, and a deterministic world, is the most that I can hope to do, and this I may now at last begin upon after all of our tedious clearing of the way. Okay? Again, he's more concerned about what kinds of views go together well than he is on trying to use incompatibilism or any other kind of a view to try and prove determinism or indeterminism. That's just not what's going on here. And so the argument that people tend to misquote is the argument where he talks about sort of feeling free. Okay, he says, look, our lived experience tells us that we have free will. Like everything we do, don't you feel like you're making decisions? Don't you feel like you're doing things freely? Right? That's his basic view. Now, the bad version of this, right? Is saying that, well, because people feel free, they must be. Okay, think about that for a second. That means that that things are true, but just because you think they are, right? I mean, that's obviously false. That's obviously a bad argument, right? Things aren't true just because you think they are, or even just because you want them to be, or even just because it would be really familiar to you if they were true, right? That's just not what makes things true. Things are true if the world is actually that way, and they're false if it isn't. And so if this is really what he's saying, he's giving us a really first-class, awful argument, okay? I don't think I cannot think that somebody like William James would actually give that kind of an argument. This is why this is a common misinterpretation of it. Rather, he means something a lot more nuanced, okay? What he is saying is that our lived experience confirms our belief in free will. Now, whether free will really does require indeterminism is a further argument, and that's like almost like all of the rest of the stuff he writes, and he sort of thinks that way. He sort of argues for his incompatibilism, right? But of course, some concept or other of free will is compatible with at least some, according to some determinists. Right? So don't misinterpret the view here. And finally, I feel like we can try and push things in a more interesting way, right? If we don't sort of worry about trying to prove that determinism or indeterminism are the case, because of course we can't. So one argument for incompatibilism of free will with determinism is the argument that determinism implies that there are not alternate possibilities and that free will requires alternate possibilities, right? This is a pretty interesting. So one definition of free will says it should be possible that you could have chosen otherwise than you actually did. Okay? That's one definition of free will. It's the definition that people like Sartre and probably James and de Holbach had in common, right? They thought that's what free will meant, is the ability to choose otherwise than you in fact do, which determinists don't think you can do. And while it might seem like the ability to have done other than you did is a requirement for free will or responsibility, there's a whole family of examples called Frankfurt-style cases after the philosopher Harry Frankfurt that cast doubt on that idea. And so here's how one of them goes, right? So imagine that you're in a room and that you're trying to decide whether to leave the room or stay in the room and, say, continue reading or something like that. After thinking about all that the outside of the room has to offer and all that the inside of the room has to offer, you decide, I'll stay in the room for a little while longer to finish my reading. Okay? Now, that sounds like a very ordinary run-of-the-mill decision. Okay? And if you made the decision to stay in the room, did you freely make that decision? Okay. It sure seems like it. It doesn't seem like it's any different than any other decision that you ever make under any other circumstances. Okay? And okay, again, you might say, are you responsible for that decision? Right? Say, whatever happens after you stay in the room, are you responsible for deciding to stay? And again, it seems like absolutely, right? It's just like every other possible thing that you've ever been responsible for. Okay, now here comes the wrinkle, right? Unbeknownst to you, the door to that room is locked from the outside, meaning that you could not have left the room had you decided to do that instead. You could not have done otherwise than you did. But remember, didn't you say, right? Stay. Would that change your answer in some way? Or are you now all of a sudden, didn't you decide freely to stay in the room? Aren't you responsible for staying in the room? Okay. And so this is where there's some question as to whether or not the free will, requires there to be any alternate possibilities. Right? This is one thing that compatibilists or determinist compatibilists tend to point to. They say, well, look, you can make all kinds of decisions even that are your decisions. They're caused by you. They're free in every way that matters, and you're responsible for them in every way that matters. It's just you couldn't have done otherwise. They were caused. They were determined. Right? But that's how things are. And this is a family of examples that sort of makes that look very interesting. And these are really interesting cases. Another interesting discussion is this, right? The text makes a lot of the incompatibility of determinism and free will and or responsibility, okay? But the text ignores whether indeterminism is any more compatible with either of these things, right? There's a lot in the text about whether free will is compatible with determinism, and almost nothing in the text about whether free will is compatible with indeterminism, right? And that's a pretty interesting discussion that I think that really ought to be had. So consider this. Indeterminism, remember, is the thesis that at least some events are uncaused. Now let's follow some chain of reasoning. It seems wrong to say that all or even most events are uncaused, right? There's at least that much that a scientific worldview gives us, right? Yes, I mean, you have to assume determinism in order to do science, but really, I think the reason why we have a scientific worldview at all, why that's even possible, is that at least a whole lot of things are caused, right? And the causes for a whole lot of things aren't even all that difficult to determine, right? They're not that difficult to ascertain. Okay? And so if you want to say that like all or even most events are uncaused, that seems to sort of go at odds with what we tend to experience. Things seem to be a little bit more consistent. They seem to follow more rules than that. And it also seems wrong to say that all human acts are uncaused, because the causal influences with so many of them are very clear and obvious, right? For example, somebody drops something on their foot, then they start, they pull their foot up off the ground, and say, ow, right? Or, some all sorts of things. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we would say, oh yeah, this caused that, right? When somebody's hungry, what do? They eat. When someone's thirsty, they drink, right? There are causes there, and they're sort of easy, basic, obvious causes. Okay? And so it would seem wrong to say that all human acts, or even most of them, are uncaused, right? Because again, those causal influences are so obvious. And so indeterminism, right, this incompatibilist indeterminist, this libertarian view, in other words, seems to require that the only uncaused events are some subset of human acts, right? Perhaps only the important acts. So like the only things in the universe that are uncaused are some of the things that people do. Not even all the things that people do, just some of them. Now that starts to sound a little odd, doesn't it? why should only important human acts be some sort of an exception? How does the universe know what's important and what isn't, right? Or even what's a human act and what isn't, right? It seems very, very strange when you think about it. Ever so much more strange than say, for example, James makes it sound. So notice the one arguing for compatibilism between indeterminism and free will must explain what is special about human acts without being able to say that human acts caused things to be uncaused, right? So you might say, oh, there's a special thing that happens in the human brain that lets us sort of that lets us break causality. What do you mean, that causes us to break causality? That, again, that's incoherent, right? That doesn't even get off the ground. It's like saying it's true that there are no truths or something like that. It's like, no, we can cause there to be no causes. It's very, very bizarre and incoherent. So it seems like trying to make something like free will or responsibility compatible with indeterminism is just as tall an order as trying to make it compatible with determinism, perhaps even more so. And so the real debate might be something really like this, okay? So the most fertile area of discussion here in this topic, what I'd really encourage you to focus your attention on, is what kinds of compatibilism or incompatibilism actually make the most sense, okay? Whether it's a compatibilism of free will with determinism or indeterminism, or responsibility with determinism or indeterminism, right? What kinds of compatibilisms or incompatibilisms seem to make the most sense? That is, what sorts of things allow the most of our ideas to fit together well, that run into fewest problems, etc. So these discussions hinge on discovering and defending the most reasonable definitions of terms like free will, responsibility, and thinking carefully about what they require without simply crafting a circular argument. Okay? So pay a lot of attention to what things have to mean and how those definitions interact with each other. That's conceptual analysis. That's what we're really aiming for here.